Chapter 11 of King Alfred of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Alfred of England by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 11. Character of Alfred's Reign. Perhaps the chief aspect in which King Alfred's character has attracted the attention of mankind is in the spirit of humanity and benevolence which he manifested, and in the efforts which he made to cultivate the arts of peace, and to promote the intellectual and social welfare of his people. Notwithstanding the warlike habits to which he was accustomed in his early years, and the warlike influences which surrounded him during all his life, everything in the outward circumstances in which he was placed tended to make him a mere military hero. He saw, however, the superior greatness and glory of the work of laying the foundations of an extended and permanent power, by arranging in the best possible manner the internal organization of the social state. He saw that intelligence, order, justice, and system prevailing in and governing the institutions of a country constitute the true elements of its greatness, and he acted accordingly. It is true, he had good materials to work with. He had the Anglo-Saxon race to act upon at the time, a race capable of appreciating and entering into his plans, and he has had the same race to carry them on, for the 10 centuries which have elapsed since he laid his foundations. As no other race of men but the Anglo-Saxons could have produced an Alfred, so probably no other race could have carried out such plans as Alfred formed. It is a race which has always been distinguished. Like Alfred, their great prototype and model, for a certain cool and intrepid energy in war, combined with and surpassed by the industry, the system, the efficiency, and the perseverance with which they pursue and perfect all the arts of peace. They systemize everything. They arrange, they organize. Everything in their heads takes form, and advances to continual improvement. Even while the rest of the world remain inert, they are active. When the arts and improvements of life are stationary among other nations, they are always advancing with them. It is a people that is always making new discoveries, pressing forward to new enterprises, framing new laws, constituting new combinations, and developing new powers, until now, after the lapse of 1,000 years, the little island feeds and clothes, directly or indirectly, a very large portion of the human race, and directs, in great measure, the politics of the world. Whether Alfred reasoned upon the capacities of the people whom he ruled, and foresaw their future power, or whether he only followed the simple impulses of his own nature in the plans which he formed and the measures which he adopted, we cannot know. But we know that, in fact, he devoted his chief attention, during all the years of his reign, to perfecting in the highest degree the internal organization of his realm, considered as a great social community. His people were in a very rude, and in fact almost half savage state when he commenced his career. He had everything to do, and yet he seems to have had no favorable opportunities for doing anything. In the first place, his time and attention were distracted, during his whole reign, by continued difficulties and contentions with various hordes of Danes, even after his peace with Guthrum. These troubles, and the military preparations and movements to which they would naturally give rise, would seem to have been sufficient to have occupied fully all the powers of his mind, and to have prevented him from doing anything effectual for the internal improvement of his kingdom. Then, besides, there was another difficulty with which Alfred had to contend, which one might have supposed would have paralyzed all his energies. He suffered all his life from some mysterious and painful internal disease, the nature of which, precisely, is not known, as the allusions to it, though very frequent throughout his life, are very general, and the physicians of the day, who probably were not very skillful, could not determine what it was, or do anything effectual to relieve it. The disease, whatever it may have been, was a source of continual uneasiness, and sometimes of extreme and terrible suffering. Alfred bore all the pain which it caused him with exemplary patience, and, though he could not always resist the tendency to discouragement and depression with which the perpetual presence of such a torment wears upon the soul, he did not allow it to diminish his exertions, or suspend, at any time, the ceaseless activity with which he labored for the welfare of the people of his realm. Alfred attached great importance to the education of his people. It was not possible in those days to educate the mass, for there were no books and no means of producing them in sufficient numbers to supply any general demand. Books, in those days, were extremely costly, as they had all to be written laboriously by hand. The great mass of the population, therefore, who were engaged in the daily toil of cultivating the land, were necessarily left in ignorance. But Alfred made every effort in his power to awaken a love for learning and the arts among the higher classes. He set them, in fact, an efficient example in his own case, by pressing forward diligently in his own studies, even in the busiest periods of his reign. The spirit and manner in which he did this are well illustrated by the plan he pursued in studying Latin. It was this. He had a friend in his court, a man of great literary attainments and great piety, whose name was Asser. Asser was a bishop in Wales. When Alfred first heard of his fame as a man of learning and abilities, Alfred sent for him to come to his court and make him a visit. Alfred was very much pleased with what he saw of Asser at this interview, and proposed to him to leave his preferments in Wales, which were numerous and important, and come into his kingdom, and he would give him a greater preferments there. Asser hesitated. Alfred then proposed to him to spend 6 months every year in England, and the remaining 6 in Wales. Asser said that he could not give an answer even to this proposal till he had returned home and consulted with the monks and the other clergy under his charge there. He would, however, he said, at least come back and see Alfred again within the next 6 months, and gave him his final answer. Then, after having spent 4 days in Alfred's court, he went away. The 6 months passed away, and he did not return. Alfred sent a messenger into Wales to ascertain the reason. The messenger found that Asser was sick. His friends, however, had advised that he should accede to Alfred's proposal to spend 6 months of the year in England, as they thought that, by that means, through his influence with Alfred, he would be better able to protect and advance the interests of their monasteries and establishments in Wales. So Asser went to England, and became, during 6 months in the year, Alfred's constant friend and teacher. In the course of time, Alfred placed him at the head of some of the most important establishments and ecclesiastical charges in England. One day, it was 8 or 9 years after Alfred's victory over Guthrum and settlement of the kingdom, the king and Asser were engaged in conversation in the royal apartments, and Asser quoted some Latin phrase with which, on its being explained, Alfred was very much pleased, and he asked Asser to write it down for him in his book. So saying, he took from his pocket a little book of prayers and other pieces of devotion, which he was accustomed to carry with him for daily use. It was, of course, in manuscript. Asser looked over it to find a space where he could write the Latin quotation, but there was no convenient vacancy. He then proposed to Alfred that he should make for him another small book, expressly for Latin quotations, with explanations of their meaning, if Alfred chose to make them in the Anglo-Saxon tongue. Alfred highly approved of this suggestion. The bishop prepared the little parchment volume, and it became gradually filled with passages in Scripture in Latin, and striking sentiments, briefly and tersely expressed, extracted from the writings of the Roman poets, or from the fathers of the Church. Alfred wrote opposite to each quotation its meaning, expressed in his own language, and as he made the book his constant companion, and studied it continually, taking great interest in adding to its stores, it was the means of communicating to him soon a very considerable knowledge of the language, and was the foundation of that extensive acquaintance with it which he subsequently acquired. Alfred made great efforts to promote in every way the intellectual progress and improvement of his people. He wrote and translated books, which were published so far as it was possible to publish books in those days, that is, by having a moderate number of copies transcribed and circulated among those who could read them. Such copies were generally deposited at monasteries and abbeys, and other such places, where learned men were accustomed to assemble. These writings of Alfred exerted a wide influence during his day. They remained in manuscript until the art of printing was invented, when many of them were printed. Others remain in manuscript in the various museums of England. where visitors look at them as curiosities, all worn and corroded as they are, and almost illegible by time. These books, though they exerted great influence at the time when they were written, are of little interest or value now. They express ideas in morals and philosophy, some of which have become so universally diffused as to be commonplace at the present day, while others would now be discarded, as not in harmony with the ideas or philosophy of the times. One of the greatest and most important of the measures which Alfred adopted for the intellectual improvement of his people was the founding of the great University of Oxford. Oxford was Alfred's residence and capital during a considerable part of his reign. It is situated on the Thames, in the bosom of a delightful valley, where it calmly reposes in the midst of fields and meadows as verdant and beautiful as the imagination can conceive. There was a monastery at Oxford before Alfred's day, and for many centuries after his time, acts of endowment were passed and charities granted, some of which were perhaps of greater importance than those which emanated from Alfred himself. Thus, some carry back the history of this famous university beyond Alfred's time. Others consider that the true origin of the present establishment should be assigned to the latter date than his day. Alfred certainly adopted very important measures at Oxford for organizing and establishing schools of instruction, and assembling learned men there from various parts of the world, so that he soon made it a great center and seat of learning, and mankind have been consequently inclined to award him the honor of having laid the foundations of the vast superstructure which has since grown up on that consecrated spot. Oxford is now a city of ancient and venerable colleges. Its silent streets, its grand quadrangles, its churches and chapels and libraries, its secluded walks, its magnificent, though old and crumbling architecture, make it, even to the passing traveler, one of the wonders of England, and by the influence which it has exerted for the past 10 centuries on the intellectual advancement of the human race, it is really one of the wonders of the world. Alfred repaired the castles which had become dilapidated in the wars. He rebuilt the ruined cities, organized municipal governments for them, restored the monasteries, and took great pains to place men of learning and piety in charge of them. He revised the laws of the kingdom, and arranged and systematized them in the most perfect manner which was possible in times so rude. Alfred's personal character gave him great influence among his people, and disposed them to acquiesce readily in the vast innovations and improvements which he introduced, changes which were so radical and affected so extensively the whole structure of society and all the customs of social life, that any ordinary sovereign would have met with great opposition in his attempt to introduce them. But Alfred possessed such a character, and proceeded in such a way in introducing his improvements and reforms, that he seems to have awakened no jealousy, and to have aroused no resistance. He was of a very calm, quiet, and placid temper of mind. The crosses and vexations which disturb and irritate ordinary men seemed never to disturb his equanimity. He was patient and forbearing, never expecting too much of those whom he employed, or resenting angrily the occasional neglects or failures in duty on their part, which he well knew must frequently occur. He was never elated by prosperity, nor made moody or morose by the turning of the tide against him. In a word, he was a philosopher of a calm and quiet and happy temperament. He knew well that every man in going through life, whether his rank and station, must encounter the usual alternations of sunshine and storm. He determined that those alternations should not mar his happiness, nor disturb the repose of his soul. That he would, on the other hand, keeping all quiet within, press calmly and steadily forward in the accomplishment of the vast objects to which he felt that his life was to be given. He was accordingly never anxious or restless, never impatient or fretful, never excited or wild, but always calm, considerate, steady, and persevering. He infused his own spirit into all around him. They say he governed by fixed and permanent principles of justice and of duty in all that he planned, and in every measure that he resorted to the execution of his plans, it was plain that his great ruling motive was a true and honest desire to promote the welfare and prosperity of his people, and the internal peace, and order, and happiness of his realm, without any selfish or sinister aims of his own. In fact, it seemed as if there were no selfish or sinister ends that possessed any charms for Alfred's mind. He had no fondness or taste for luxury or pleasure, or for aggrandizing himself in the eyes of others by pomp and parade. It is true that, as was stated in a former chapter, he was charged in early life with a tendency to some kinds of wrong indulgence. But these charges, obscure and doubtful as they were, pertained only to the earliest periods of his career, before the time of his seclusion. Through all the middle and latter portions of his life, the sole motive of his conduct seems to have been a desire to lay broad and deep and lasting foundations for the permanent welfare and prosperity of his realm. It resulted from the nature of the measures which Alfred undertook to effect, that they brought upon him daily a vast amount of labor, as such measures always involve a great deal of minute detail. Alfred could only accomplish this great mass of duty by means of the most unremitting industry, and the most systematic and exact division of time. There were no clocks or watches in those days, and yet it was very necessary to have some plan for keeping the time, in order that his business might go on regularly, and also that the movements and operations of his large household might proceed without confusion. Alfred invented a plan. It was as follows. He observed that the wax candles which were used in his palace and in the churches burned very regularly, and with greater or less rapidity according to their size. He ordered some experiments to be made, and finally, by means of them, he determined on the size of a candle which should burn 3 inches in an hour. It is said that the weight of wax which he used for each candle was 12 pennyweights. That is but a little more than half an ounce, which would make, one would suppose, a taper rather than a candle. There is, however, great doubt about the value of the various denominations of weight and measure, and also of money used in those days. However this may be, the candles were each a foot long, and of such size that each would burn 4 hours. They were divided into inches, and marked so that each inch corresponded with a third of an hour, or 20 minutes. A large quantity of these candles were prepared, and a person in one of the chapels was appointed to keep a succession of them burning, and to ring the bells, or give other signals, whatever they might be, by which the household was regulated, at the successive periods of time denoted by their burning. As each of these candles was 1 foot long, and burned 3 inches in an hour, it follows that it would last 4 hours. When this time was expired, the attendant who had the apparatus in charge lighted another. There were, of course, 6 required for the whole 24 hours. The system worked very well, though there was one difficulty that occasioned some trouble in the outset, which, however, was not much to be regretted after all, since the remedying of it awakened the royal ingenuity anew, and led, in the end, to adding to Alfred's other glories the honor of being the inventor of lanterns. The difficulty was that the wind, which came in very freely in those days, even in royal residences through the open windows, blew the flames of these horological candles about, so as to interfere quite seriously with the regularity of their burning. There was no glass for windows in those days, or at least very little. It had been introduced, it is said, in one instance, and that it was a monastery in the north of England. The abbot, whose name was Benedict, brought over some workmen from the continent, where the art of making glass windows had been invented, and caused them to glaze some windows in his monastery. It was many years after this before glass came into general use, even in churches and palaces, and other costly buildings of that kind. In the meantime, windows were mere openings in stone walls, which could be closed only by shutters, and inasmuch as when closed they excluded the light as well as the air, they could ordinarily be shut only on one side of the apartment at a time, the side most exposed to the winds and storms. Alfred accordingly found that the flame of his candles was blown by the wind, which made the wax burn irregularly, and, to remedy this evil, he contrived the plan of protecting them by thin plates of horn. Horn, when softened by hot water, can easily be cut and fashioned into any shape, and, when very thin, is almost transparent. Alfred had these thin plates of horn prepared, and set into the sides of a box, made to open to receive them, thus forming a rude sort of lantern, within which the time-keeping candles could burn in peace. Mankind have consequently given to King Alfred the credit of having invented lanterns. Having thus completed his apparatus for the correct measurement of time, Alfred was enabled to be more and more systematic in the division and employment of it. One of the historians of the day relates that his plan was to give 1/3 of the 24 hours to sleep and refreshment, 1/3 to business, and the remaining third to the duties of religion. Under this last head was probably included all those duties and pursuits which, by the customs of the day, were considered as pertaining to the church, such as study, writing, and the consideration and management of ecclesiastical affairs. These duties were performed in those days almost always by clerical men, and in the retirement and seclusion of monasteries, and were thus regarded as in some sense religious duties. We must conclude that Alfred classed them thus, as he was a great student and writer all his days, and there is no other place than this third head to which the duties of this nature can be assigned. Thus understood, it was a very wise and sensible division, though 8 hours daily, for any long period of time appropriated to services strictly devotional, would not seem to be a wise arrangement, especially for a man in the prime of his life, and in a position demanding the constant exercise of his powers in the discharge of active duties. Thus the years of Alfred's life passed away, his kingdom advancing steadily all the time in good government, wealth, and prosperity. The country was not, however, yet freed entirely from the calamities and troubles arising from the hostility of the Danes. Disorders continually broke out among those who had settled in the land, and in some instances new hordes of invaders came in. These were, however, in most instances, easily subdued, and Alfred went on with comparatively little interruption for many years in prosecuting the arts and improvements of peace. At last, however, toward the close of his life, a famous Northman leader named Hastings landed in England at the head of a large force, and made, before he was expelled, a great deal of trouble. An account of this invasion will be given in the next chapter. End of chapter 11. Recording by Ryan Sherrick. Chapter 12 of King Alfred of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Alfred of England by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 12. The Close of Life. It was 12 or 15 years after Alfred's restoration to his kingdom, by means of the victory at Edendune, that the great invasion of Hastings occurred. That victory took place in the year 878. It was in the years 893 to 897 that Hastings and his horde of followers infested the island, and in 900 Alfred died, so that his reign ended, as it had commenced, with protracted and desperate conflicts with the Danes. Hastings was an old and successful soldier before he came to England. He had led a wild life for many years as a sea king on the German Ocean, performing deeds which, in our day, entail upon the perpetrator of them the infamy of piracy and murder, but which then entitled the hero of them to a very widespread and honorable fame. Afterward, Hastings landed upon the continent, and pursued for a long time a glorious career of victory and plunder in France. In these enterprises, the tide indeed sometimes turned against him. On one occasion, for instance, he found himself obliged to give way before his enemies, and he retreated to a church, which he seized and fortified, making it his castle until a more favorable aspect of his affairs enabled him to issue forth from his retreat and take the field again. Still, he was generally very successful in his enterprises. His terrible ferocity and that of his savage followers were dreaded in every part of the civilized world. Hastings had made one previous invasion of England, but Guthrum, faithful to his covenants with Alfred, repulsed him. But Guthrum was now dead, and Alfred had to contend against his formidable enemy alone. Hastings selected a point on the southern coast of England for his landing. Guthrum's Danes still continued to occupy the eastern part of England, and Hastings went round on the southern coast until he got beyond their boundaries, as if he wished to avoid doing anything directly to awaken their hostility. Guthrum himself, while he lived, had evinced a determination to oppose Hastings' plans of invasion. Hastings did not know, now, that Guthrum was dead, whether his successors would oppose him or not. He determined at all events to respect their territory, and he so passed along on the southern shore of England till he was beyond their limits, and then prepared to land. He had assembled a large force of his own, and he was joined, in addition to them, by many adventurers who came out to attach themselves to his expedition from the bays and islands and harbors which he passed on his way. His fleet amounted to at least 250 vessels. They arrived at length at a part of the coast where there extends a vast tract of low and swampy land, which was then a wild and dismal morass. This tract, which is known in modern times by the name of the Romney Marshes, is of enormous extent, containing, as it does, 50,000 acres. It is now reclaimed, and is defended by a broad and well-constructed dike from the inroads of the sea. In Hastings' time, it was a vast waste of bogs and mire, utterly impassable except by means of a river, which, meandering sluggishly through the tangled wilderness of weeds and bushes in a deep black stream, found an outlet at last to the sea. Hastings took his vessels into this river, and, following its turnings for some miles, he conducted them at last to a place where he found more solid ground to land upon. But this ground, though solid, was almost as wild and solitary as the morass. It was a forest of vast extent, which showed no signs of human occupancy, except that the peasants who lived in the surrounding regions had to come down to the lowest point accessible, and were building a rude fortification there. Hastings attacked them and drove them away. Then, advancing a little further, until he found an advantageous position, he built a strong fortress himself, and established his army within its lines. His next measure was to land another force near the mouth of the Thames, and bring them into the country, until he found a strong position where he could entrench and fortify the second division as he had done the first. These two positions were but a short distance from each other. He made the combined center of his operations, going from them in all directions in plundering excursions. Alfred soon raised an army and advanced to attack him, and these operations were the commencement of a long and tedious war. A detailed description of the events of this war, the marches and countermarches, the battles and sieges, the various successes first of one party and then of the other, given historically in the order of time, would be as tedious to read as the war itself was to endure. Alfred was very cautious in all his operations, preferring rather to trust the plan of wearing out the enemy by cutting off their resources and hemming them constantly in, than to incur the risk of a great decisive battle. In fact, watchfulness, caution, and delay are generally the policy of the invaded when a powerful force has succeeded in establishing itself among them, while, on the other hand, the hope of the invaders lies ordinarily in prompt and decided action. Alfred was well aware of this, and made all his arrangements with a view to cutting off Hastings' supplies, shutting him up into as narrow a compass as possible, heading him off in all his predatory excursions, intercepting all detachments, and thus reducing him at length to the necessity of surrender. At one time, soon after the war began, Hastings, true to the character of his nation for treachery and stratagem, pretended that he was ready to surrender, and open a negotiation for this purpose. He agreed to leave the kingdom if Alfred would allow him to depart peacefully, and also, which was a point of great importance in Alfred's estimation, to have his two sons baptized. While, however, these negotiations were going on between the two camps, Alfred suddenly found that the main body of Hastings' army had stolen away in the rear, and were marching off by stealth to another part of the country. The negotiations were, of course, immediately abandoned, and Alfred set off with all his forces in full pursuit. All hopes of peace were given up, and the usual series of sieges, maneuverings, battles, and retreats was resumed again. On one occasion, Alfred succeeded in taking possession of Hastings' camp. When he had left it in security, as he supposed, to go off for a time by sea on an expedition, Alfred's soldiers found Hastings' wife and children in the camp, and took them prisoners. They sent the terrified captives to Alfred to suffer, as they supposed, the long and cruel confinement, or the violent death to which the usages of those days consigned such unhappy prisoners. Alfred baptized the children, and then sent them with their mother, loaded with presents and proofs of kindness, back to Hastings again. This generosity made no impression upon the heart of Hastings, or, at least, it produced no effect upon his conduct. He continued the war as energetically as ever. Months passed away, and new reinforcements arrived, until at length he felt strong enough to undertake an excursion into the very heart of the country. He moved on for a time with triumphant success. But this very success was soon the means of turning the current against him again. It aroused the whole country through which he was passing. The inhabitants flocked to arms. They assembled at every rallying point, and drawing up on all sides near and nearer to Hastings' army, they finally stopped his march, and forced him to call all his forces in, and entrench himself in the first place of retreat that he could find. Thus, his very success was the means of turning his good fortune into disaster. And then, in the same way, the success of Alfred and the Saxons soon brought disaster upon them too, in their turn, for, after succeeding in shutting Hastings closely in, and cutting off his supplies of food, they maintained their watch and ward over their imprisoned enemies so closely as to reduce them to extreme distress, a distress and suffering which they thought would end in their complete and absolute submission. Instead of ending thus, however, it aroused them to desperation. Under the influence of the frenzy which such hopeless sufferings produce in characters like theirs, they burst out one day from their place of confinement, and, after a terrible conflict which choked up a river which they had to pass with dead bodies and dyed its waters with blood, the great body of the starving desperadoes made their escape, and, in a wild and furious excitement, half a triumph and half a retreat, they went back to the eastern coast of the island, where they found secure places of refuge to receive them. In the course of the subsequent campaigns, a party of the Danes came up the river Thames with a fleet of their vessels, and an account is given by some of the ancient historians of a measure which Alfred restored to entrap them. In the course of the subsequent campaigns, a party of the Danes came up the river Thames with a fleet of their vessels, and an account is given by some of the ancient historians of a measure which Alfred resorted to entrap them, which would seem to be scarcely credible. The account is, that he altered the course of the river, by digging new channels for it, so as to leave the vessels all aground, when of course they became helpless and fell as easy prey to the attackers of their enemies. That is, at least a very improbable statement, for a river like the Thames occupies always the lowest channel of the land through which it passes to the sea. Besides, such a river, in order that it should be possible for vessels to ascend it from the ocean, must have the surface of its water very near to the level of the surface of the ocean. There can, therefore, be no place to which such waters could be drawn off, unless into a valley below the level of the sea. All such valleys, whenever they exist in the interior of a country, necessarily get filled with water from brooks and rains, and so become lakes or inland seas. It is probable, therefore, that it was some other operation which Alfred performed to imprison the hostile vessels in the river, more possible in its own nature than the drawing off of the waters of the Thames from their ancient bed. Year after year passed on, and though neither the Saxons nor the Danes gained any very permanent and decisive victories, the invaders were gradually losing ground, being driven from one entrenchment and one stronghold to another, until at last their only places of refuge were their ships, and the harbors along the margin of the sea. Alfred followed on and occupied the country as fast as the enemy was driven away, and when at last they began to seek refuge in their ships, he advanced to the shore, and began to form plans for building ships, and manning and equipping a fleet, to pursue his retiring enemies upon their own element. In this undertaking he proceeded in the same calm, deliberate, and effectual manner as in all his preceding measures. He built his vessels with great care. He made them twice as long as those of the Danes. He placed them so as to make them more steady, more safe, and capable of carrying a crew of rowers so numerous as to be more active and swift than the vessels of the enemy. When these naval preparations were made, Alfred began to look out for an object of attack on which he could put their efficiency to the test. He soon heard of a fleet of the Northmen's vessels on the coast of the Isle of Wight, and he sent a fleet of his own ships to attack them. He charged the commander of this fleet to be sparing of life, but to capture the ships and take the men, bringing as many as possible to him unharmed. There were 9 of the English vessels, and when they reached the Isle of Wight, they found 6 vessels of the Danes in a harbor there. 3 of these Danish vessels were afloat, and came out boldly to attack Alfred's armament. The other 3 were upon the shore, where they had been left by the tide, and were, of course, disabled and defenseless, until the water should rise and float them again. Under these circumstances, it would seem that the victory for Alfred's fleet would have been easy and sure, and at first the result was, in fact, in Alfred's favor. Of the 3 ships that came out to meet him, 2 were captured and 1 escaped, with only 5 men left on board of it alive. The Saxon ships, after thus disposing of the 3 living and moving enemies, pushed boldly into the harbor to attack those which were lying lifeless on the sands. They found, however, that though successful in the encounter with the active and the powerful, they were destined to disaster and defeat in approaching the defenseless and the weak. They got aground themselves in approaching the shoals on which the vessels of their enemies were lying. The tide receded and left 3 of the vessels on the sands, and kept the rest so separated and so embarrassed by the difficulties and dangers of their situation as to expose the whole force to the most imminent danger. There was a fierce contest in boats and on the shore. Both parties suffered very severely, and finally the Danes, getting first released, made their escape and put to sea. Notwithstanding this partial discomfiture, Alfred soon succeeded in driving the ships of the Danes off his coast, and in thus completing the deliverance of his country. Hastings himself went to France, where he spent the remainder of his days in some territories which he had previously conquered, enjoying, while he continued to live, and for many ages afterward, a very extended and honorable fame. Such exploits as those which he had performed conferred, in those days, upon the hero who performed them, a very high distinction, the luster of which seems not to have been at all tarnished in the opinions of mankind by any ideas of the violence and wrong which the commissions of such deeds involved. Alfred's dominions were now left once more in peace, and he himself resumed again his former avocations. But a very short period of his life, however, now remained. Hastings was finally expelled from England about 897. In 900 or 901, Alfred died. The interval was spent in the same earnest and devoted efforts to promote the welfare and prosperity of his kingdom that his life had exhibited before the war. He was engaged diligently and industriously in repairing injuries, redressing grievances, and rectifying everything that was wrong. He exacted rigid impartiality in all the courts of justice. He held public servants of every rank and station to strict accountability, and in all the colleges and monasteries and ecclesiastical establishments of every kind, he corrected all abuses and enforced a rigid discipline, faithfully extirpating from every lurking place all semblance of immorality or vice. He did these things, too, with so much kindness and consideration for all concerned, and was actuated in all he did so unquestionably by an honest and sincere desire to fulfill his duty to his people and to God, that nobody opposed him. The good considered him their champion. The indifferent readily caught a portion of his spirit and wished him success, while the wicked were silenced if they were not changed. Alfred's children had grown up to maturity, and seemed to inherit, in some degree, their father's character. He had a daughter named Ethelfleda, who was married to a prince of Mercia, and who was famed all over England for the superiority of her mental powers, her accomplishments, and her moral worth. The name of his oldest son was Edward. He was to succeed Alfred on the throne, and it was a source now of great satisfaction to the king to find his son emulating his virtues, and preparing for an honorable and prosperous reign. Alfred had warning, in the progress of his disease, of the approach of his end. When he found that the time was near at hand, he called his son Edward to his side, and gave him these farewell counsels, which express in few words the principles and motives by which his own life had been so fully governed. Thou, my dear son, set thee now beside me, and I will deliver thee true instructions. I feel that my hour is coming. My strength is gone. My countenance is wasted and pale. My days are almost ended. We must now part. I go to another world, and thou art to be left alone, in the possession of all that I have thus far held. I pray thee, my dear child, to be a father to thy people. Be the children's father, and the widow's friend. Comfort the poor, protect and shelter the weak, and, with all thy might, right that which is wrong. And, my son, govern thyself by law. Then shall the Lord love thee, and God himself shall be thy reward. Call thou upon him to advise thee in all thy need, and he shall help thee to compass all thy desires. Alfred was 52 years of age when he died. His death was universally lamented. The body was interred in the great cathedral at Winchester. The kingdom passed peacefully and prosperously to his son, and the arrangements which Alfred had spent his life in framing and carrying into effect soon began to work out their happy results. The constructions which he founded stand to the present day, strengthened and extend rather than impaired by the hand of time, and his memory, as their founder, will be honored as long as any remembrance of the past shall endure among the minds of men. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Ryan Cherrick. Chapter 13 of King Alfred of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Alfred of England by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 13. The Sequel. The romantic story of Godwin forms the sequel to the history of Alfred, leading us onward, as it does, towards the next great era in English history, that of William the Conqueror. Although, as we have seen in the last chapter, the immediate effects of Alfred's measures was to re-establish peace and order in his kingdom, and although the institutions which he founded have continued to expand and develop themselves down to the present day, still it must not be supposed that the power and prosperity of his kingdom, and of the Saxon dynasty, continued wholly uninterrupted after his death. Contentions and struggles between the two great races of Saxons and Danes continued for some centuries to agitate the island. The particular details of these contentions have in these days, in a great measure, lost their interest for all but professed historical scholars. It is only the history of great leading events, and the lives of really extraordinary men, in the annals of early ages, which can now attract the general attention even of cultivated minds. The vast movements which have occurred and are occurring in the history of mankind in the present century throw everything except what is really striking and important in early history into the shade. The era which comes next in the order of time to that of Alfred in the course of English history, as worthy to arrest general attention, is, as we have already said, that of William the Conqueror. The life of this sovereign forms the subject of a separate volume of this series. He lived 2 centuries after Alfred's day, and although, for the reasons above given, a full chronological narration of the contentions between the Saxon and Danish lines of kings, which took place during this interval, would be of little interest or value, some great knowledge of the state of the kingdom at this time is important, and may be best communicated in connection with the story of Godwin. Godwin was by birth a Saxon peasant, of Warwickshire. At the time when he arrived at manhood, and was tending his father's flocks and herds like other peasant sons, the Saxons and the Danes were at war. It seems that one of Alfred's descendants, named Ethelred, displeased his people by his misgovernment, and was obliged to retire from England. He went across the Channel, and married there the sister of a Norman chief named Richard. Her name was Emma. Ethelred hoped by this alliance to obtain Richard's assistance in enabling him to recover his kingdom. The Danish population, however, took advantage of his absence to put one of their own princes upon the throne. His name was Canute. He figures in English history, accordingly, among the other English kings, as Canute the Dane, that appellation being given him to mark the distinction of his origin in respect to the kings who preceded and followed him, as they were generally of the Saxon line. It was this Canute of whom the famous story is told that, in order to rebuke his flatterers, who, in extolling his grandeur and power, had represented to him that even the elements were subservient to his will, he took his stand upon the seashore when the tide was coming in, with his flatterers by his side, and commanded the rising waves not to approach his royal feet. He kept his symphonic courtiers in this ridiculous position until the encroaching waters drove them away, and then dismissed them overwhelmed with confusion. The story is told in 1,000 different ways, and with a great variety of different embellishments, according to the fancy of the several narrators. All that there is now any positive evidence for believing, however, is that probably some simple incident of this kind occurred, out of which the stories have grown. Canute did not hold his kingdom in peace. Ethelred sent his son across the Channel into England to negotiate with the Anglo-Saxon powers for his own restoration to the throne. An arrangement was accordingly made with them, and Ethelred returned, and a violent civil war immediately ensued between Ethelred and the Anglo-Saxons on the one hand, and Canute and the Danes on the other. At length Ethelred fell, and his son Edmund, who was at the time of his death one of his generals, succeeded him. Emma and his 2 other sons had been left in Normandy. Edmund carried on the war against Canute with great energy. One of his battles was fought in the county of Warwick, in the heart of England, where the peasant Godwin lived. In this battle the Danes were defeated, and the discomfited generals fled in all directions from the field, whenever they saw the readiest hope of concealment or safety. One of them, named Ulf, took a byway which led him in the direction of Godwin's father's farm. Night came on, and he lost his way in a wood. Men, when flying under such circumstances from a field of battle, avoid always the public roads, and seek concealment in unfrequented paths, where they easily get bewildered and lost. Ulf wandered all night in the forest, and when the morning came he found himself exhausted with fatigue, anxiety, and hunger, certain to perish unless he could find some succor, and yet dreading the danger of being recognized as a Danish fugitive if he were to be discovered by any of the Saxon inhabitants of the land. At length he heard the shouts of a peasant who was coming along a solitary pathway through the wood, driving a herd to their pasture. Ulf would gladly have avoided him if he could have gone on without succor or help. His plan was to find his way to the Severn, where some Danish ships were lying in hopes of a refuge on board of them. But he was exhausted with hunger and fatigue, and utterly bewildered and lost, so he was compelled to go forward and take the risk of accosting the Saxon stranger. He accordingly went up to him and asked him his name. Godwin told him his name, and the name of his father, who lived, he said, at a little distance in the wood. While he was answering the question, he gazed very earnestly at the stranger, and then told him that he perceived he was a Dane, a fugitive, he supposed, from the battle. Ulf, thus finding that he could not be concealed, begged Godwin not to betray him. He acknowledged that he was a Dane, and that he had made his escape from the battle, and he wished, he said, to find his way to the Danish ships in the Severn. He begged Godwin to conduct him there. Godwin replied by saying that it was unreasonable and absurd for a Dane to expect guidance and protection from a Saxon. Ulf offered Godwin all sorts of rewards if he would leave his herd and conduct him to a place of safety. Godwin said that the attempt, were he to make it, would endanger his own life without saving that of the fugitive. The country, he said, was all in arms. The peasantry, emboldened by the late victory obtained by the Saxon army, were everywhere rising, and although it was not far to the Severn, yet to attempt to reach the river while the country was in such a state of excitement would be a desperate undertaking. They would almost certainly be intercepted, and, if intercepted, their exasperated captors would show no mercy, Godwin said, either to him or to his guide. Among the other inducements which Ulf offered to Godwin was a valuable gold ring, which he took from his finger, and which, he said, should be his if he would consent to be his guide. Godwin took the ring into his hand, examined it with much apparent curiosity, and seemed to hesitate. At length he yielded, though he seems to have been induced to yield, not by the value of the offered gift, but by compassion for the urgency of the distress which the offer of it indicated. For he put the ring back into Ulf's hand, saying that he would not take anything from him, but he would try to save him. Instead, however, of undertaking the apparently hopeless enterprise of conducting Ulf to the Severn, he took him to his father's cottage, and concealed him there. During the day they formed plans for journeying together, not to the ships in the Severn, but to the Danish camp. They were to set forth as soon as it was dark. When the evening came, and all was ready, and they were about to commence their dangerous journey, the old peasant, Godwin's father, with an anxious countenance and manner, gave Ulf this solemn charge. "This is my only son. In going forth to guide you under these circumstances, he puts his life at stake. Trusting to your honor, he cannot return to me again, as there will be no more safety for him among his own countrymen, after having once been a guide for you. When therefore you reach the camp, present my son to your king, and ask him to receive him into his service. He cannot come again to me." Ulf promised very earnestly to do all this and much more for his protector, and then, bidding the father farewell, and leaving him in his solitude, the two adventurers sailed forth into the dark forest, and went their way. After various adventures, they reached the camp of the Danes in safety. Ulf faithfully fulfilled the promises that he had made. He introduced Godwin to the king, and the king was so much pleased with the story of his general's escape, and so impressed with the marks of capacity and talent which the young Saxon manifested, that he gave Godwin immediately a military command in his army. In fact, a young man who could leave his home and his father, and abandon the cause of his countrymen forever under such circumstances, must have had something besides generosity towards a fugitive enemy to impel him. Godwin was soon found to possess a large portion of that peculiar spirit which constitutes a soldier. He was ambitious, stern, energetic, and always successful. He rose rapidly in influence and rank, and in the course of a few years, during which King Canute triumphed wholly over his Saxon enemies, and established his dominion over almost the whole realm, he was promoted to the rank of a king, and ruled, second only to Canute himself, over the kingdom of Wessex, one of the most important divisions of Canute's empire. Here he lived, and reigned in peace and prosperity for many years. He was married, and he had a daughter named Edith, who was as gentle and lovely as her father was terrible and stern. They said that Edith sprung from Godwin, like a rose from its stem of thorns. A writer who lived in those days, and recorded the occurrences of the times, says that, when he was a boy, his father was employed in some way in Godwin's palace, and that in going to and from school he was often met by Edith, who was walking attended by her maid. On such occasions, Edith would stop him, he said, and question him about his studies, his grammar, his logic, and his verses, and she would often draw him into an argument on those subtle points of disputation which attracted so much attention in those days. Then she would commend him for his attention and progress, and order her woman to make him a present of some money. In a word, Edith was so gentle and kind, and took so cordial an interest in whatever concerned the welfare and happiness of those around her, that she was universally beloved. She became, in the end, as we shall see in due time, the English queen. In the meantime, while Godwin was governing, as vicegerent, the province which Canute had assigned him, Canute himself extended his own dominion far and wide, reducing first all England under his sway, and then extending his conquest to the continent. Edmund, the Saxon king, was dead. His brothers, Edward and Alfred, the two remaining sons of Ethelred, were with their mother in Normandy. They, of course, represented the Saxon line. The Saxon portion of Canute's kingdom would, of course, look to them as their future leaders. Under these circumstances, Canute conceived the idea of propitiating the Saxon portion of the population, and combining, so far as was possible, the claims of the two lines, by making the widow Emma his own wife. He made the proposal to her, and she accepted it. Pleased with the idea of being once more a queen, she came to England, and they were married. In process of time, they had a son, who was named Hardicanute, which means Canute the Strong. Canute now felt that his kingdom was secure, and hoped, by making Hardicanute his heir, to perpetuate the dominion in his own family. It is true that he had older children, whom the dames might look upon as more properly his heirs, and Emma also had two other children, the sons of Ethelred in Normandy. These the Saxons would be likely to consider as their rightful heirs to the throne. There was danger, therefore, that at his death parties would again be formed, and the civil wars break out anew. Canute and Emma, therefore, seem to have acted wisely, and to have done all that the nature of this case admitted to prevent a renewal of these dreadful struggles, by concentrating their combined influence in favor of Hardicanute, who, though not absolutely the heir to either line, still combined in some degree the claims of both of them. Canute also did all in his power to propitiate his Anglo-Saxon subjects. He devoted himself to promoting the welfare of the kingdom in every way. He built towns and constructed roads. He repaired and endowed the churches. He became a very zealous Christian, evincing the ardor of his piety, whether real or pretended, by all the forms and inducements common in those days. Finally, to crown all, he went on a pilgrimage to Rome. He set out on this journey with great pomp and parade, and attended by a large retinue, and yet still strictly like a pilgrim. He walked, and carried a wallet on his back, and a long pilgrim's staff in his hand. This pilgrimage, at the time when it occurred, filled the world with its fame. At length, King Canute died, and then, unfortunately, it proved that all his seemingly wise precautions against the recurrence of civil wars were taken in vain. It happened that Hardicanute, whom he had intended should succeed him, was in Denmark at the time of his father's death. Godwin, however, proclaimed him king, and attempted to establish his authority, and to make Emma a sort of regent to govern in his name until he could be brought home. The Danish chieftains, on the other hand, elected and proclaimed one of Canute's older sons, whose name was Harold, and they succeeded in carrying a large part of the country in his favor. Godwin then summoned Emma to join him in the west, with such forces as she could command, and both parties prepared for war. Then ensued one of those scenes of terror and suffering which war, and sometimes the mere fear of war, brings often in its train. It was expected that the first outbreak of hostilities would be in the interior of England, near the banks of the Thames, and the inhabitants of the whole region were seized with apprehensions and fears, which spread rapidly, increased by the influence of sympathy, and excited more and more every day by 1,000 groundless rumors, until the whole region was thrown into a state of uncontrollable panic and confusion. The inhabitants abandoned their dwellings, and fled in dismay into the eastern part of the island, to seek refuge among the fens and marshes of Lincolnshire, and of the other counties around. Here, as has already been stated in a previous chapter when describing the Abbey of Croyland, where a great many monasteries and convents, and hermitages, and other religious establishments, filled with monks and nuns, the wretched fugitives from the expected scene of war crowded into this region, besieging the doors of the abbeys and monasteries to beg for shelter, or food, or protection. Some built huts among the willow woods which grew in the fens. Others encamped at the roadsides, or under the monastery walls, wherever they could find the semblance of shelter. They presented, of course, a piteous spectacle. Men infirm with sickness or age, were exhausted with anxiety and fatigue, children harassed by the wayworn, and helpless mothers, with still more helpless babies at their breasts. These monks, instead of being moved to compassion by the sight of these unhappy sufferers, were only alarmed on their own account at such an inundation of misery. They feared that they should be overwhelmed themselves. Those whose establishments were large and strong barred their doors against the suppliants, and the hermits who lived alone in detached and separate solitudes abandoned their osier huts, and fled themselves to seek some place more safe from such intrusions. And yet, after all, The whole scene was only a false alarm. Men acting in a panic are almost always running into the ills which they think they shun. The war did not break out on the banks of the Thames at all. Hardicanute, deterred, perhaps, by the extent of the support which the claims of heralds were receiving, did not venture to come to England, and Emma and Godwin, and those who would have taken their side, having no royal head to lead them, gave up their opposition, and acquiesced in Harold's reign. The fugitives, and the marshals and the fens returned to their homes. The country became tranquil. Godwin held his province as a sort of lieutenant general of Harold's kingdom, and Emma herself joined his court in London, where she lived with him, ostensibly, on very friendly terms. Still, her mind was ill at ease. Harold, though the son of her husband, was not her own son, and the ambitious spirit which led her to marry for her second husband her first husband's rival and enemy, that she might be a second time a queen, naturally made her desire that one of her own offspring, either of the Danish or the Saxon side, should inherit the kingdom. For the reader must not forget that Emma, besides being the mother of Hardicanute by her second husband Canute, the Danish sovereign, was also the mother of Edward and Alfred by her first husband Ethelred, of the Anglo-Saxon line, and that these two sons were in Normandy now. The family connection will be more apparent to the eye by the following scheme: Ethelred the Saxon and Emma, Canute the Dane, Edward Alfred on the Saxon line, Hardicanute on the Danish line. Harold was the son of Canute by the former marriage. Emma, of course, felt no maternal interest in him, and though compelled by circumstances to acquiesce for a time in his possession of the kingdom, her thoughts were continually with her own sons, and since the attempt to bring Hardicanute to the throne had failed, she began to turn her attention toward her Norman children. After scheming for a time, she wrote letters to them, proposing that they should come to England. She represented to them that the Anglo-Saxon portion of the people were ill at ease under Harold's dominion, and would gladly embrace any opportunity of having a Saxon king. She had no doubt, she said, that if one of them were to appear in England and claim the throne, the people would rise in mass to support him, and he would easily get possession of the realm. She invited them, therefore, to repair secretly to England, to confer with her on the subject, charging them, however, to bring very few, if any, Norman attendants with them, as the English people were inclined to be very jealous of the influence of foreigners. The brothers were very much elated at receiving these tidings, so much so that in their zeal they were disposed to push the enterprise much faster than their mother had intended. Instead of going themselves, quietly and secretly, to confer with her in London, they organized an armed expedition of Norman soldiers. The youngest Alfred, with an enthusiasm characteristic of his years, took the lead in these measures. He undertook to conduct the expedition. The eldest consented to his making the attempt. He landed at Dover, and began his march through the southern part of the country. Godwin went forth to meet him. Whether he would join his standard or meet him as a foe, no one could tell. Emma considered that Godwin was on her side, though even she had not recommended an armed invasion of the country. It is very probable that Godwin himself was uncertain at first what course to pursue, and that he intended to have espoused Prince Alfred's cause if he had found that it presented any reasonable prospect of success, or that he might have felt bound to serve Harold faithfully, now that he had once given in his adhesion to him. Of course, he kept his thoughts and plans to himself, leaving the world to see only his deeds. But if he had ever entertained any design of espousing Alfred's cause, he abandoned it before the time arrived for action. As he advanced in the southern part of the island, he called together the leading Saxon chiefs to hold a council, and he made an address to them when they were convened, which had a powerful influence on their minds in preventing their deciding in favor of Alfred. However much they might desire a monarch of their own line, this, he said, was not the proper occasion for effecting their end. Alfred was, it was true, an Anglo-Saxon by descent, but he was a Norman by birth and education. All his friends and supporters were Normans. He had come now into the realm of England with a retinue of Norman followers, who would, if he were successful, monopolized the honors and offices which he would have to bestow. He advised the Anglo-Saxon chieftains, therefore, to remain inactive, to take no part in the contest, but to wait for some other opportunity to re-establish the Saxon line of kings. The Anglo-Saxon chieftains seem to have considered this good advice. At any rate, they made no movement to sustain young Alfred's cause. Alfred had advanced to the town of Guilford. Here he was surrounded by a force which Harold had sent against him. There was no hope or possibility of resistance. In fact, his enemies seemed to have arrived at a time when he did not expect an attack, for they entered the gates by a sudden onset, when Alfred's followers were scattered about the town at the various houses to which they had been distributed. They made no attempt to defend themselves, but were taken prisoners one by one, wherever they were found. They were bound with cords and carried away like ordinary criminals. Of Alfred's 10 principal Norman companions, 9 were beheaded. For some reason or other, the life of the one was spared. Alfred himself was charged with having violated the peace of his country, and was condemned to lose his eyes. The torture of this operation, and the inflammation which followed, destroyed the unhappy prince's life. Neither Emma nor Godwin did anything to save him. It was wise policy, no doubt, in Emma to disavow all connection with her son's unfortunate attempt, now that it had failed. And ambitious queens have to follow the dictates of policy instead of obeying such impulses as maternal love. She was, however, secretly indignant at the cruel fate which her son had endured, and she considered Godwin as having betrayed him. After this dreadful disappointment, Emma was not likely to make any farther attempts to place either of her sons upon the throne. But Harold seems to have distrusted her, for he banished her from the realm. She had still her Saxon son in Normandy, Alfred's brother, Edward, and her Danish son in Denmark. She went to Flanders, and there sent to Hardicanute, urging him by the most earnest importunities to come to England and assert his claims to the crown. He was doubly bound to do it now, she said, as the blood of his murdered brother called for retribution, and he could have no honorable rest or peace until he had avenged it. There was no occasion, however, for Hardicanute to attempt force for the recovery of his kingdom, for not many months after these transactions Harold died, and then the country seems generally to acquiesce in Hardicanute's accession. The Anglo-Saxons, discouraged, perhaps by the discomfiture of their cause in the person of Alfred, made no attempt to rise. Hardicanute came accordingly and assumed the throne. But though he had not courage and energy enough to encounter his rival Harold during his lifetime, he made what amends he could by offering base indignities to his body after he was laid in the grave. His first public act after his accession was to have the body disinterred, and, after cutting off the head, he threw the mangled remnants into the Thames. The Danish fishermen in the river found them, and buried them again in a private sepulchre in London, with such concealed marks of respect and honor as it was in their power to bestow. Hardicanute also instituted legal proceedings to inquire into the death of Alfred. He charged the Saxons with having betrayed him, especially those who were rich enough to pay the fines by which, in those days, it was very customary for criminals to atone for their crimes. Godwin himself was brought before the tribunal, and charged with being accessory to Alfred's death. Godwin positively asserted his innocence, and brought witnesses to prove that he was entirely free from all participation in the affair. He took also a much more effectual method to secure an acquittal, by making to the king Hardicanute some of the most magnificent presents. One of these was a small ship, profusely enriched and ornamented with gold. It contained 80 soldiers, armed in the Danish style, with weapons of the most highly finished and costly construction. They each carried a Danish axe on their left shoulder, and a javelin in the right hand, both richly gilt, and they had each of them a bracelet on his arm, containing 6 ounces of solid gold. Such at least is the story. The presents might be considered in the light either of a bribe to corrupt justice, or in that of a fine to satisfy it. In fact, the line in those days between bribes and purchase acquittal and fines atoning for the offense seems to not have been very accurately drawn. Hardicanute, when fairly established on his throne, governed his realm like a tyrant. He oppressed the Saxons especially, without any mercy. The effect of his cruelties, and those of the Danes who acted under him, was, however, not to humble and subdue the Saxon spirit, but to awaken and arouse it. Plots and conspiracies began to be formed against him, and against the whole Danish party. Godwin himself began to mediate some decisive measures, when, suddenly, Hardicanute died. Godwin immediately took the field at the head of all of his forces, and organized the general movement throughout the kingdom for calling Edward, Alfred's brother, to the throne. The insurrection was triumphantly successful. The Danish forces that undertook to resist it were driven to the northward. The leaders were slain or put to flight. A remnant of them escaped to the seashore, where they embarked on board such vessels as they could find, and left England forever. And this was the final termination of the political authority of the Danes over the realm of England, the consummation and end of Alfred's military labors and schemes, coming surely at last, though deferred for 2 centuries after his decease. What follows belongs rather to the history of William the Conqueror than to that of Alfred, for Godwin invited Edward, Emma's Norman son, to come and assume the crown, and his coming, together with that of the many Norman attendants that accompanied or followed him, led in the end to the Norman invasion and conquest. Godwin might probably have made himself king if he had chosen to do so. His authority over the whole island was paramount and supreme. But, either from a natural sense of justice towards the rightful heir, or from a dread of the danger which always attends the usurping of the royal name by one who is not of royal descent, he made no attempt to take the crown. He convened a great assembly of all the estates of the realm, and there it was solemnly decided that Edward should be invited to come to England and ascend the throne. A national messenger was dispatched to Normandy to announce the invitation. It was stipulated in this invitation that Edward should bring very few Normans with him. He came accordingly, in the first instance, almost unattended. He was received with great joy, and crowned king with splendid ceremonies and great show, in the ancient cathedral at Winchester. He felt under great obligations to Godwin, to whose instrumentality he was wholly indebted for the sudden and most brilliant change in his fortunes, and partly impelled by this feeling of gratitude, and partly allured by Edith's extraordinary charms. He proposed to make Edith his wife. Godwin made no objection. In fact, his enemies say that he made a positive stipulation for this match before allowing the measures for Edward's elevation to the throne to proceed too far. However this may be, Godwin found himself, after Edward's accession, raised to the highest pitch of honor and power. From being a young herdsman's son, driving the cows to pasture in a wood, he had become the prime minister, as it were, of the whole realm, his 4 sons being great commanding generals in the army, and his daughter, the queen. The current of life did not flow smoothly with him, after all. We cannot here describe the various difficulties in which he became involved with the king on account of the Normans, who were continually coming over from the continent to join Edward's court, and whose coming and growing influence strongly awakened the jealousy of the English people. Some narration of these events will more properly precede the history of William the Conqueror. We accordingly close this story of Godwin here by giving the circumstances of his death, as related by the historians of the time. The readers of this narrative will, of course, exercise severally their own discretion in determining how far they will believe the story to be true. The story is that one day he was seated at Edward's table, at some sort of entertainment, when one of his attendants, who was bringing in a goblet of wine, tripped one of his feet, but contrived to save himself by dexterously bringing up the other in such a manner as to cause some amusement to the guests. Godwin said, referring to the man's feet, that one brother saved the other. "Yes," said the king, "brothers have need of brothers' aid. Would to God that mine were still alive." In saying this, he directed a meaning glance toward Godwin, which seemed to be insinuate, as, in fact, the king had sometimes done before, that Godwin had had some agency in young Alfred's death. Godwin was displeased. He reproached the king with the unreasonableness of his surmises, and solemnly declared that he was wholly innocent of all participation in that crime. He imprecated the curse of God upon his head if this declaration was not true, wishing that the next mouthful of bread that he should eat might choke him if he had contributed in any way, directly or indirectly, to Alfred's unhappy end. So saying, he put the bread into his mouth, and in the act of swallowing it, he was seized with a paroxysm of coughing and suffocation. The attendants hastened to his relief. The guests rose in terror and confusion. Godwin was borne away by the two of his sons, and laid on his bed in convulsions. He survived the immediate injury, but after lingering 5 days, he died. Edward continued to reign in prosperity long after this event, and he employed the sons of Godwin as long as he lived in the most honorable stations of public service. In fact, when he died, he named one of them as his successor to the throne. End of chapter 13. End of King Alfred of England by Jacob Abbott.